Spring is supposed to be a hopeful time in Boston sports. The weather starts getting warmer, the regular seasons begin giving way to playoff races, and fans start allowing themselves to imagine what the next few months might look like if everything breaks the right way. This year, both the Bruins and the Celtics gave their supporters reasons to believe. One team accelerated a rebuild far faster than expected. The other spent much of the year looking like a legitimate championship contender. Different expectations, different circumstances, different paths, but both organizations entered the postseason believing there was still more to accomplish. And for a while, that belief seemed justified. What's good, New England? I'm Lauren, and welcome back to the Granite Slate Sports Podcast. The Bruins fought their way back into relevance under first-year head coach Marco Sturm, turning what many expected to be a transitional season into a 100-point campaign and a playoff berth. The Celtics, meanwhile, spent the year reinforcing the idea that they belonged among the Eastern Conference's elite, armed with star power, offensive firepower, and aspirations that extended well beyond the first round. Neither season followed the same script, but both created genuine optimism. Then the playoffs arrived. For the Bruins, the postseason exposed the gap between being a good team and being a true Stanley Cup contender. For the Celtics, it exposed something potentially more painful, the difference between having the talent to advance and actually finishing the job. One team left the playoffs believing its future remains bright despite an early exit. The other left wondering how a series that appeared won somehow slipped away. Today, we're looking back at the seasons of both teams, examining what went wrong, what went right, and what comes next. We'll start with the Bruins, whose surprising rise ended against Buffalo before turning our attention to a Celtics team that suffered one of the most disappointing playoff collapses of the Boston sports year. The Boston Bruins season came to an end with a 4-1 loss to the Buffalo Sabres in Game 6. And on the surface, it's easy to look at the result and feel disappointed. This was a team that finished with 100 points, comfortably reached the playoffs, and spent much of the year establishing itself as one of the NHL's biggest surprise stories. Yet when the postseason arrived, the Bruins managed just 11 goals in 6 games, lost all 3 home games in the series, and ultimately fell to a Buffalo team that looked deeper and more dangerous offensively. But what's interesting about the reaction to Boston's elimination is that very few people seem interested in calling the season a failure. In fact, most of the discussion since the series ended has centered on a completely different idea. The Bruins may have lost in the first round, but the bigger question is whether they ever should have been expected to get this far in the first place. To understand why so many people around the organization remain optimistic, despite the early exit, it's necessary to go back to where expectations were when this season began. Coming into the year, the Bruins were widely viewed as a team in transition. The franchise was attempting an on-the-fly rebuild while still trying to remain competitive, a balancing act that often leaves organizations stuck in the middle. There were questions throughout the roster, questions about the long-term direction of the team, and questions about what first-year head coach Marco Sturm would be able to accomplish. Reaching the playoffs was far from a guarantee. Instead, Boston produced one of the biggest turnarounds in the league. By the end of the regular season, the Bruins had improved by 24 points compared to the previous year and finished with 100 points. At the Olympic break, they sat firmly in playoff position and had established an identity built around structure, discipline, and strong defensive play. The foundation of the team's success was obvious, and Jeremy Swayman delivered elite goaltending and played like one of the best goalies in hockey. Charlie McAvoy continued to anchor the defense. David Pastrnak remained the offensive centerpiece. Around them, the Bruins found contributions throughout the lineup and consistently discovered ways to win games. That success changed the conversation around the organization. What had looked like a rebuilding team suddenly looked like a playoff team. What appeared to be a long-term project suddenly looked like a group that was ahead of schedule. By the time the postseason arrived, the Bruins had already accomplished more than most people expected. But there was one important question lingering beneath the surface. Were they truly as good as their record suggested? One of the most compelling arguments to emerge after the playoff loss is that Boston spent much of the regular season outperforming its underlying numbers. While the Bruins finished with 100 points, their 5-on-5 expected goal share was just 46.66%. Among NHL teams, only a handful posted worse numbers, and none of those teams qualified for the playoffs. In other words, Boston's statistical profile often looked more like that of a fringe playoff team than a legitimate contender. So how did the Bruins win so many games? The answer was a combination of elite goaltending, timely scoring, strong special teams, and a defensive structure that consistently helped them outperform expectations. Some analysts referred to them as the above-expected Bruins, a team that repeatedly found ways to generate better results than the underlying numbers suggested they should. Throughout the regular season, that formula worked. Swayman erased mistakes, the team capitalized on scoring opportunities, the power play delivered when it needed to, Boston found ways to win close games over and over again. Against Buffalo, however, those advantages began to disappear, the margins became smaller, the goals became harder to find, the ability to consistently outperform expectations faded. The playoff series exposed weaknesses that had existed all year but had often been hidden by outstanding goaltending and opportunistic scoring. The result was what one writer described as the Great Regression. The Bruins stopped beating the numbers, and when that happened, the flaws became impossible to ignore. The simplest explanation for Boston's elimination is also the most obvious. The Bruins could not score. Over 6 playoff games, they managed just 11 goals, a total that was never going to be enough against a team as talented as Buffalo. For long stretches of the series, the offense relied heavily on David Pastrnak, while secondary scoring failed to materialize. The Sabres were able to focus their defensive attention on Boston's top threats because there simply weren't enough dangerous offensive options elsewhere in the lineup. The offensive problems extended beyond goal totals. Buffalo controlled significant portions of play throughout the series and consistently forced the Bruins to react rather than dictate. Boston struggled to establish sustained offensive zone pressure, frequently lost the forecheck battle, and had difficulty generating the type of chances necessary to break through against playoff-caliber competition. While different analysts focused on different details, the conclusions were remarkably similar. Some pointed to a lack of secondary scoring. Others highlighted chemistry concerns and lineup instability. Still others focused on the Bruins' inability to create enough offense at 5-on-5. Whatever explanation was used, the end result was the same. The Bruins were not eliminated because of poor goaltending. They were not eliminated because of a single bad bounce. They were eliminated because Buffalo exposed the roster's biggest weakness. Boston simply did not have enough offensive depth to survive a playoff series against a stronger opponent. Despite the disappointment, one theme repeatedly surfaced after the season ended: experience. Marco Sturm has spoken extensively about the value of playoff hockey for younger players, and the Bruins entered this postseason with several important pieces of their future experiencing the playoffs for the first time. Players such as James Hagens, Marat Kusnutinov, and Fraser Minten were exposed to an entirely different level of intensity than anything they had experienced during the regular season. Sturm's view is that these experiences matter even when they end painfully. Young players have to understand how difficult playoff hockey really is. They have to experience the pressure, the physicality, and the emotional swings that come with postseason competition. They have to learn what separates good teams from championship teams. Most importantly, they have to experience failure before they can learn how to overcome it. That perspective helps explain why the organization remains optimistic despite the early exit. The Bruins believe the lessons learned during this series will benefit the players who are expected to form the core of the next great Boston team. The message from the coaching staff has been consistent. This season was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning of one. Now the focus shifts to what comes next. The Bruins have proven they are no longer a rebuilding team, but they have also proven they are not yet a legitimate Stanley Cup contender. The playoff loss to Buffalo highlighted several areas that still require significant improvement, and the biggest concern is offense. Boston needs more scoring depth. The team needs more players capable of contributing consistently when the games become tighter and the competition becomes stronger. Questions also remain at center. Elias Lindholm struggled to produce offense at the level expected of a top-line player, and there will undoubtedly be discussions about larger future roles for players such as Pavel Zacha, James Hagens, and Matt Poitras. Defensively, there is still work to do as well, particularly on the right side of the blue line. While Charlie McAvoy remains one of the league's premier defensemen and the foundation of the defense is solid, the roster is not complete, that reality doesn't diminish what the Bruins accomplished this season. If anything, it reinforces how impressive the turnaround really was. A year ago, the conversation centered around rebuilding. Today, the conversation centers around what moves are needed to turn a playoff team into a contender. That is a dramatically different place for the organization to be. The Bruins didn't get the ending they wanted. They didn't make a deep playoff run. They didn't prove they were ready to compete for the Stanley Cup. What they did prove is that the rebuild is working, the foundation is strong, and the future is considerably brighter than it appeared just 1 year ago. The challenge now is taking the next step and transforming a surprising success story into a genuine championship threat. The Celtics' playoff exit lands differently because this was not supposed to be a learning experience. Boston was not ahead of schedule, not rebuilding, and not simply happy to be in the postseason. This was a team built to contend, and for most of the season, it looked exactly like that. At the All-Star break, the Celtics were sitting near the top of the Eastern Conference, powered by an elite offense and led by the same star duo that has defined this era of Boston basketball, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. The roster looked deeper, more balanced, and better equipped for the playoffs than it had the year before. The expectation was not just to win a round, the expectation was to make a serious run. That is what separates this from the Bruins' half of the story. With the Bruins, the question was whether they were ready. With the Celtics, the assumption was that they already were. The regular season had given people reason to believe the Celtics had enough scoring, enough depth, enough experience, and enough top-end talent to handle a first-round matchup. They had the stars. They had the offense. They had home court. They had the resume of a contender. Nothing about this team suggested that a first-round collapse was coming, and that is why the ending feels so severe. This was not a roster that ran into a clearly superior opponent and simply discovered its ceiling. The articles all point towards something more frustrating than that. Boston had the tools to win this series. Boston had enough chances to win this series. Boston had every reason to win this series. The problem was not that the Celtics were never good enough. The problem is that they looked good enough for almost the entire season, then failed when it mattered most. For 4 games against Philadelphia, the Celtics looked like they were on their way to doing exactly what contenders are supposed to do. They built a 3-1 lead, delivered a dominant Game 4 performance, and appeared to have complete control of the series. At that point, the question was not whether Boston could survive Philadelphia. The question was how quickly the Celtics would finish the job and move on to the next round. Philadelphia looked wounded, Boston looked confident, and the series felt like it had reached its natural conclusion. That 3-1 lead is the central fact of the entire collapse. It changes the way everything else is judged. Losing a long, competitive series is one thing, losing after being outplayed from the beginning is another. But losing after taking control, after putting the opponent on the edge, after needing just one win in 3 tries, is something entirely different. Boston did not need to rescue its season. It did not need to climb out of a hole. It did not need a dramatic comeback. It needed one more win. Instead, the Celtics let the series breathe again. They gave Philadelphia room to believe. What looked like a finished series became a live one, and once that happened, the pressure started to shift. The Sixers no longer looked like a team waiting to be eliminated. The Celtics no longer looked like a team calmly closing out a weaker opponent. The entire tone of the matchup changed, and Boston never regained control. The most damaging part of the series is not just Game 7. It is everything that happened before Game 7. Boston had multiple chances to end the series and repeatedly failed to take them. Game 5 was the first major missed opportunity, a chance to close out Philadelphia at TD Garden in front of the home crowd, with the series still firmly in Boston's hands. Instead of ending it there, the Celtics let the Sixers survive. Game 6 gave them another chance, and again they failed to finish the job. By the time the series returned to Boston for Game 7, the situation had changed completely. The Celtics still had home court, but they no longer had the same psychological advantage. Philadelphia had won 2 straight, Boston had failed twice to finish the series, and the pressure that once belonged to the Sixers now belonged almost entirely to the Celtics. That is why the home losses matter so much. Boston lost games 2, 5, and 7 at TD Garden. A team with championship expectations cannot repeatedly give away home playoff games and expect the story to be treated like a normal defeat. The Yahoo article's focus on Boston's broken streak only adds to that sense of shock. The Celtics had built a reputation for closing games once they created separation, and that identity vanished in this series. Leads were not safe. Control was not permanent. Every time Boston had a chance to make the series feel over, Philadelphia found a way back in. The Celtics were not eliminated by one bad night. They were eliminated by the accumulation of chances they failed to finish. What makes the collapse even harder to square with the regular season is that Boston's offense was supposed to be the thing it could trust. This was one of the team's great strengths. The Celtics had star scoring, spacing, shooting, and enough offensive depth to overwhelm teams when everything was flowing. But against Philadelphia, especially as the series tightened, the offense became unreliable at exactly the wrong time. The Nessin and Sports Hub pieces both point toward the same broad issue: poor shooting, stagnant offense, and missed chances. The Celtics went through cold stretches that became more damaging as the pressure increased. The ball movement slowed. Possessions became more predictable. Instead of playing like a team imposing its strengths, Boston started to look like a team searching for answers. That is a brutal shift for a contender because once the offense stops creating pressure, everything else becomes heavier. The key point is that the coverage does not frame this as a talent shortage. This was not the Bruins struggling because the roster still needed several more pieces. The Celtics had the players. They had the offensive ceiling. They had enough firepower to win the series. The criticism is that they did not execute. When the games got tight, the offense did not rise to the moment. It tightened, stalled, and gave Philadelphia exactly the opening it needed. Philadelphia deserves credit for what happened next. The Celtics opened the door, but the Sixers still had to walk through it. Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey became the defining figures of the comeback, and the articles repeatedly framed their performances as the force that turned Boston's mistakes into a completed collapse. Embiid gave Philadelphia the superstar production it needed, while Maxey's scoring and confidence made the Sixers more dangerous as the series went on. That confidence shift is one of the most important parts of the story. After Game 4, Philadelphia looked like the team trying to survive. By Game 7, the Sixers looked like the team that believed. Every Boston miss, every failed closeout chance, every home loss pushed more momentum toward Philadelphia. The Sixers grew into the series while the Celtics shrank under the pressure of what they were about to lose. By the end, the emotional balance of the series had flipped completely. Boston was no longer the confident contender closing out a first-round opponent. Philadelphia was no longer the team waiting to be finished. The Sixers were playing with belief while the Celtics were carrying the weight of a collapse that everyone could see forming in real time. That is why the series feels like both a Philadelphia comeback and a Boston failure. The Sixers earned it, but the Celtics gave them the path. This is why the Celtics' exit feels harsher than the Bruins' exit. The Bruins lost because they were not quite ready. The Celtics lost despite appearing ready. The Bruins' season ended with the sense that a young, ahead-of-schedule team had found its limits. The Celtics' season ended with the sense that a contender had failed to finish a series it should have won. That difference matters. Nobody is grading the Celtics on a curve. Nobody is saying this was valuable playoff experience for a team just beginning its climb. The standard was higher because the team was better, deeper, and more established. Boston had championship expectations, took a 3-1 lead, had multiple chances to close, and still lost the series. That is not a normal first-round exit. That is a failure of execution, composure, and finishing ability. The most damaging conclusion from the articles is that Boston did not lose because it lacked talent. It lost because the things contenders are supposed to do, protect home court, close out a wounded opponent, execute late, survive cold stretches, and respond to pressure, did not happen. The Celtics had everything they needed except the final step, and in the playoffs, that is the only step that matters. For most of the season, the Celtics looked like a team built for a deep playoff run. Through 4 games against Philadelphia, they looked like a team on its way there. Then the series changed. The shooting faded, the offense tightened, the missed opportunities piled up, and Philadelphia gained belief with every game Boston failed to close. That is what makes this ending so painful. The Celtics did not spend the series looking overmatched. They spent most of it looking in control. Then, with a 3-1 lead and 3 chances to finish the job, They let it slip away. The Bruins' loss asked how close an overachieving team might be to contention. The Celtics' loss asks something much harsher. How does a team with this much talent, this much control, and this many opportunities fail to finish? The strange thing about playoff exits is that they often reveal more about a team than regular season success ever could. For the Bruins, the playoffs confirmed both their progress and their limitations. They proved they were no longer rebuilding, proved they could compete for a playoff spot, and proved they had a foundation worth building around. At the same time, Buffalo exposed the areas that still separate them from the league's true contenders. The ending wasn't what they wanted, but the broader trajectory remains encouraging. For the Celtics, the lessons are far less comfortable. The talent was there. The expectations were there. The opportunity was there. Yet the result was still an early exit after holding a 3-1 series lead. The questions facing Boston this summer won't be about potential. They'll be about execution, composure, and why a team with championship aspirations couldn't close out a series it appeared to control. In the end, both teams enter the offseason facing very different challenges. The Bruins must figure out how to take the next step. The Celtics must figure out why they failed to take the one that was already in front of them. And for Boston fans, that may be the most frustrating part of all. That does it for this week's episode of the Granite Slate Sports Podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check us out next week for all the latest updates from the world of sports.